Welcome to the award-winning West End Video Newsletter. My name is Joe Piccolo, your host for this week's newsletter. My co-host today is James Campano, editor of the West Ender Newsletter. And we have we're honored to have a special guest here today, political columnist for the Herald, Mr. Peter Lucas. Welcome, Peter.
Good to be here.
Peter, you have West End roots. You grew up in the West End.
I was born and grew up in the West End for the first 9 years of my life before we moved to Somerville, where my memories are much more vivid than growing up in the West End, but I do remember the West End very well.
Tell us, did your parents immigrate from?
My parents immigrated from Albania, and we lived at 73 Poplar Street on the fourth floor. And that's where I was born, and as well as my two brothers. And as I say, we grew up there in our formative ages, and it was a wonderful childhood. We used to be able to leave the house and walk down to Charles Street. This is long before Storrow Drive was there, and cross over into what we called then the Polish Park, and walk along the Charles River, and we used to swim there.
The Polish Park was located now where the Museum of Science is.
That's right. And we walked down to the Longfellow Bridge, where there was a little, what we called a beach, and we used to swim there, right by the Longfellow Bridge. On other occasions, we'd travel all over the place. We used to be able to walk through, I was Boston at that time, up through the State House, where years later I ended up working out of as a political columnist. Down into Scully Square, I used to shine shoes down there, particularly during World War II, when the place was loaded with sailors, as you may recall, and a lot of barrooms. And, of course, the old Howard and all the other...
Joe Nemo's?
Joe and Nemo's, the Hot Sod Kings from coast to coast. I remember them vividly. And the Red Hat, which is still there in another life.
How old were you when you shined shoes at Scully Square?
Oh, I was probably about 7 years old.
And was it dangerous in those days for a 7-year-old to...
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. As I say, we were like princes of the city. And I'm sure you recall, you used to be able to walk all over the city. Another way we had of making money was to go down to North Station and dust off cars for a couple of pennies or a nickel or so on. And there were no car washes, obviously. We're going back to an era when the tallest building in the city was the Custom House.
Wow.
And it was a different city. It was a different time. It was a different life. And I've always maintained that the destruction of the West End was the worst urban renewal project that ever took place in this country.
I agree with you. I lived in the West End myself, so I wholeheartedly agree with you.
I walk through parts of the old West End now by the Charles Street prison and up by the Peter Faneuil School where I went to, and it's still there. And it's just a marvelous feeling. It's too bad the rest of the other side of Cambridge Street had to be destroyed.
Yeah, I always dream about walking through the streets and trying to and remembering the stores and the churches.
When I was a kid, the concerts at the Half Shell were neighborhood concerts with Arthur Fiedler. You used to walk down to them with your parents, sit in the grass, and they were never crowded, but they were for the West Enders. And there was no Storrow Drive. Now, Arthur Fiedler's dead, of course, but now they hold these concerts now, and the people come from all over, and it's not what it once was.
The West End, was it a safe place to live in those days?
In my memory, it was. The only trouble I could ever recall was older boys would gamble from time to time, and the police in their silver bullets, that's what they called the cars then, because they were the police cars because they were painted silver. They'd come, but gambling was a crime back then. I mean, that's talk about street crime.
That was a major crime in the West End, was gambling.
Times have changed.
Did you, there was a large Albanian population colony in the West End. Are you familiar with, do you still keep in contact with any of them?
Well, that colony and other colonies, the other immigrant groups, moved out, mostly west, as the West End was destroyed, and moved into Somerville. And that Albanian colony that existed in the West End moved into Somerville, the Winter Hill area of Somerville, where my more formative years were spent. And some of it is still there. My mother still lives in the first floor of a three-decker that my father bought for $6,000 in 1943.
Jimmy, do you have any?
Oh, sure. Now, I grew up in the West End, and I moved to Somerville myself, okay? And I was just wondering if you noticed, if you could comment on the difference in culture between the West End and Somerville.
Well, Somerville back then was much different than it is now. It was open. By that I mean, we lived on 2 Century Street in an area called Skin Village.
Yeah.
And when I was young, we used to be able, from my house, leave my house, walk down a dirt road, past houses where they grew chickens, little farms, right? Down the dirt road, across Mystic Avenue, into the Mystic River, where we used to swim. There was no traffic. To the right, where those sad housing projects are, down by St. Polycarp, was all open. That was marshland, and there'd be bulrushes there. That's the type of land that you couldn't take in 1990 to build on. And we would go down there, and in the wintertime we'd ice skate through there because it would freeze up. In the summertime we'd catch snakes and frogs. There was a lot of huckleberry fin to growing up in Somerville at that time.
What year was that?
This would be in 1943, 44, 45, until the end of the World War II. And that's when times changed because they started building those sad housing projects.
I noticed in one of your columns you mentioned something about the West End, which was how I originally took notice of you. I was wondering if you had any of the qualities of, any of the life, qualities of life in the West End, you were able to draw on later. And, I didn't know if anything in the West End helped you. Were there any advantages to growing up in the West End?
Sure.
That helped you later on in life is what I think I'm stumbling on.
The West End was not, a paradise.
Right.
It had its problems. But one thing the West End had was, first you had a family unit.
Right.
You had a father and you had a mother. And people worked hard. Families were not deserted. Young people were not left on their own, as they are today in many cases. Then you had an ethnic cooperative spirit. And beyond that, you had a neighborhood. Now, we may have been Albanians living on the 4th floor, but there were Greeks living on the 3rd floor. There were Jews living on the 2nd floor, and a black family on the 1st floor. But everybody got along. You didn't have any of the racial conflict or ethnic conflict that you have so much of in the 1990s. It was a different era. Granted, the times may have been slower. Granted, everybody may have been poor, but you never knew you were poor.
Kane Simonian of the BRA, was quoted as saying that if they didn't tear the West End down, it would have turned into a black neighborhood, and who wanted that? Do you think there was any racial prejudice in the decision to take the West End?
Well, there was never any racial prejudice that I recall in the West End growing up there.
I'm talking about...
Just let me finish the start. Because in our gang, there were, a couple of black youngsters that we played with, and I just want to make this one point. Because later on, when we moved to Somerville, and those black brothers visited us in Somerville, and they were severely discriminated against. That's when I saw my first encounter with discrimination was in Somerville, when they visited us in a neighborhood where there were no blacks, as opposed to the West End where there were blacks. I don't think it would have turned black. Why should it? It'd probably, if they left the West End alone, it'd be like Beacon Hill is today.
Sure.
A mixed neighborhood. The houses were just as substantial.
The same housing stock.
Same housing stock as the Cambridge Street side of Beacon Hill. So why would it have been any different? It wouldn't have.
Well, that was
a big con job,
the
tearing down of the West End. Because I remember it was supposed to be torn down, and the people moved out, and they were supposed to have the first shot to move back in when the new apartments were built, and that was just a blatant falsehood.
Well, the original plan in '54 said 4.5 acres of low and moderate income housing, which was later changed, and they never made it public. So everybody just sort of was waiting for it, and it just waited forever. It sort of just moved on.
Do you recall any of the settlement houses in the West End growing up?
I remember the
Did you
Peabody House,
Mm-hmm.
the West End house.
Uh-huh.
Peabody House was on Charles Street, right down the bottom of Poplar Street, where we grew up. And, you know, I think about it, when you think about daycare, we had daycare then.
Mm-hmm.
Because my mother used to drop me off and my brothers off and in the Peabody House, and she would go upstairs and attend cooking classes
Mm-hmm.
or English-speaking classes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was daycare. And this is 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They had
daycare.
They
Right.
had the first public playground and the first daycare in the nation.
It was what Peabody House did.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember their playhouse at all?
Oh, I remember the playhouse. Yes. I remember my older brother was used to take fencing lessons at the Peabody House, and one of the people in his class was the fellow who later became Dr. Spock.
Leonard Nimoy.
Leonard Nimoy. And he has a picture of him and 4 or 5 other boys in his fencing class with Leonard Nimoy.
The Bostonian Society has received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they're going to put in a display after they renovate the old State House, and they're going to have a West End exhibit for a year and a half. I was wondering, could you think of anything that you would like to see in that exhibit about
I'd like
West
to
End?
see a map of how the streets were structured
Right.
and how they went. I can recall walking throughout the place, but then I forget what the streets were and where we went, and because time, passes, and I'd like to see a vivid, well-done map of the place. So you could trace Spring Street, where they used to have the push carts. I can recall the older boys when I was young, just a kid, the fellows who sold fruit and produce would come up Poplar Street, which is a hill, to go up to Spring Street, and the older boys would help them push their vehicles, their push carts, up Poplar Street to get to Spring Street, where their stands were, Silver Bakery on one side and on the other. I'd like to see like documentation like that, pictures if there are any that exist.
The map, I think we may be able to help you out, because in the next newsletter we're putting in a map.
Oh, good.
So
That's
that'll
the
help.
sad part about the taking of the West End. We can't go back to a neighborhood. There's nothing. Our boyhood days are gone. They're all gone. It's been destroyed, and that should have never happened.
I remember I remember when we were kids, what we used to do is get some fruit from the vendors up in, probably steal it, from the vendors on Spring Street, and we'd go down to, what's the street beside the Charles Street jail? Blossom Street? Fruit Street? Fruit Street. And we go down Fruit Street and we throw the stuff over the prison wall, and these poor inmates. And I mentioned that in a column I did a couple of years ago. And lo and behold, I got a letter from an inmate in some prison in Maryland who claimed he had been serving time. I don't think that's true. He claimed he had been serving time in South Street Jail, and some kids did this, and he accused me of
That's
being one of them.
amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
You know, Jerome Rappaport has been called the 14th city councilor. He has enormous pull at the city council level, and he's been cited as one of the reasons that they defeated interior historical designation for the Vilna Show. Does he have this kind of pull on the state level too? Or
Not as much in the state level he has in the city level. It's harder for him to have that kind of influence on the state, in the State House, because all his power has been concentrated, as far as Massachusetts is concerned, in the city and among the Boston City Council, because it's a smaller group and it can be controlled much easier than the legislature, the House and the Senate and the executive branch.
This has been real interesting so far. Next, we're going to lead up to we're going to go to a tape made in 1962. It's a documentary of some of the opinions of it was filmed right in the West End, and it's a documentary on the tearing down of the West End and the history of it. So, are we ready to roll the tape now?
There's only one way that the West End could have gone, and it was down. The people there were getting poorer, the tenements there were falling down, the fire hazard was increasing. There's only one way you can cure a place like the West End, and that is to wipe it out. It's a cancer in the long run on the community. This may seem ruthless, but this is an aspect of urban renewal, and the human equation to this somewhat ruthless removal of a cancer in the city's economic structure hasn't been entirely found yet.
Supposedly everybody should be glad to leave, but our research team, consisting of psychiatrists, social psychologists, and social scientists, soon discovered that for many of the families there, to live in the West End meant a privilege rather than a bad necessity. They had a beautiful recreation area right next door along the Charles River. They had a way of life in their streets, of a lot of communication from family to family, across the street, from window to window. A great many ways had been developed of companionship and mutual help in an informal way within large families and from family to family, which allowed them to put up with a bad housing with just the same, a sense of relative comfort. And many of the homes, looking perhaps ugly from the outside, were well appointed inside and had many attractive features arranged by the families in their efforts to create a comfortable life.
I am quite certain that under the present setup that the rights of people are being respected as much as possible, but it's silly to say that when you're having a major municipal hysterectomy like this, that everybody's going to come out exactly the same. You just aren't. And some people are going to be hurt, and their rights, in my opinion, will not be entirely respected. But when you're moving thousands of people around, you were really doing it for the good of the whole, and the people of Boston will benefit enormously from this.
The word slum is a loaded word. It tells you how the user of the word feels. It doesn't tell you anything about the thing which he is talking about. So that if I use the word slum with reference to a particular section of a city, this simply says in some way that I disapprove of, that I don't like, that I devalue that area. When the redevelopment authority, the newspapers, the rest of society says to them, you are living in a slum. This is a blighted area. This is something which can be destroyed and which is expendable. It hits the person in the very core of his being, because this means I am no good. I am expendable. I can be shoved around by society.
We don't care. Let them say what they want. We were happy here. People kept coming in, like I said, from different states and said to us, well, how could you live here? You know, this is slums. These are our homes, and we're happy here.
I think most people misunderstand completely the problems of politicians like myself in dealing with this urban renewal program. We are not against it. This city council, quite to the contrary, has devoted extraordinary effort in trying to get the urban renewal authority to do more. Our major quarrel with the program is that it's not moving fast enough. But no matter how fast or how slowly the program moves, you cannot escape, you will never escape, the human problems involved. People just don't like to be told by an emissary of the city, the state, or the federal government. They just don't like to be told. They regard it as something out of a page of Adolf Hitler, that a person representing our government on any level can walk right in, and simply because they say that the home or the property was blighted, move them out and tear the property down. I would add this one point. In this whole picture of urban renewal, you can't forget people.
Interesting, wasn't it? That was quite a tape, Peter. Peter, getting back to the West End, there was so many ethnic backgrounds. You really didn't have to go out of the West End to do any shopping, whether you were Italian, Jewish, Albanian. There were stores that catered to every one of these groups. You recall?
I recall that. There were even, Russian stores. The shopping back then reminds me a lot of the shopping in Europe in Belfast or in London or in Paris, where you did it every day because you didn't have the refrigeration, and the products were fresh, and it was in walking distance. And don't forget, back then you didn't have both parents working. The father worked and the mother stayed home and brought up the family and did the shopping almost on a daily basis. You could get Jewish bread and Italian products, Greek, anything you wanted. It was just a multi-ethnic neighborhood, and it was marvelous.
Something that you'll never see again anywhere.
Well, I don't think you'll see it again because the time is gone. The place has disappeared, and times have changed.
They sure have.
Lowell Square has been in court and waiting for a decision almost a year. If Rappaport wins, he'll be allowed to get a piece of land for $100,000 that's worth, by anybody's estimation, $10 to $15 million. He seems to have a lot of influence in the courts, too. Do you think he's trying to outlast the Flynn administration? Because the Flynn administration is the only one that has actually put his feet to the fire.
I have to say this about the Flynn administration. I think it's much closer to the people than past administrations at City Hall. Flynn himself is a neighborhood guy growing up in South Boston and very sympathetic to the neighborhood. We all know that. If Flynn were mayor, at the time, the West End project never would have happened.
Right.
I think, Rappaport, his time may have passed. His son now is running for the United States Senate. It's a different era.
Right.
I did mention to his son one time how I grew up in the West End and how his father was a principal in the demolition of the West End. And he rightly said, I wasn't born then, which is true.
Yeah.
The sins of the father, I think, should remain with the father and not passed on.
We agree.
True. But he has also, they've also taken from HUD. He's still part of the Charles River Park conglomerate.
That's true.
Okay, and he still works out of the Charles River Park conglomerate. If he had dissociated himself with it, I would agree with you totally.
No, the destruction of the West End was an aching pain, and just hasn't gone away.
Well, the only thing is that piece of land that he's still fighting for, and he won't let go. Okay?
I don't know if he can. I don't know if he can win it. I don't know. It seems like it's a battle that should have ended a long time ago, but it's still being waged in 1990.
Well, we're going to fight till the end, till that land goes back to West End people. Affordable housing for former West Enders. That's how you won't
try
let that
that
go.
anyway.
Well, that's good. That's good. Good to hear.
Well,
It would be marvelous if West Enders could move back in there.
Sure.
Marvelous.
We're hoping someday that will happen.
Well, it's supposed to happen. Okay, what happened is if Rappaport loses, the Archdiocese and former West Enders, who were part of what the Archdiocese planned, within a year there'll be plans and they'll be building on the lot, okay, for cooperatives, for low and moderate income housing, with preference for West End people.
I think you have an ally in Ray Flynn.
I believe that. I believe that wholly.
Jim, Rappaport is just going to be receiving an award. Can you tell us about that one?
Oh, Rappaport has received an award from the American Jewish Committee for his human relations in the reshaping of the city. Now, we've been inundated with phone calls, especially from our Jewish readers, who feel that this is an affront. Okay, I myself feel a little sensitive about getting involved in a Jewish award. Okay, other than if they were giving it to him as being a developer or anything else, but for his human relations and the reshaping of the city, I don't think he has any human relations.
Alan Lupo wrote a critical column about that in the Globe.
I read that.
Maybe they don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're all from New York or Long Island or something. Right. But anybody who's grown up in the city would look askance on giving him an award of that type.
Yeah. Like I say, and especially in the Jewish community, there's been quite a few calls.
The West End, the location of the West End, you mentioned at the beginning of the show, was centrally located. You could go to the Boston Common or the Charles River or downtown Boston shop. That's the sad part about the whole thing. He virtually got this for nothing.
For nothing, and it was so well located. You could walk to the State House. You could walk to your Victory Garden. You could walk to the Hatch Shell. You could walk every place. It was better than Beacon Hill.
It was truly an urban village. That's what we call it.
It was an urban village.
Well, the West End was the first place to be
It's such a
called urban.
wasteland now. You can't walk through the West
Right.
End. You don't walk among those high-rise apartment houses. You
Those-
just don't.
those-
Nobody walks there.
No.
Those places have been called like as looking like public housing with balconies. So I don't know if the architecture isn't considered the greatest.
I had one brother who, some years ago, when he was still single, went into Charles River Park and rented an apartment, and he lasted one night. One night, he moved out and went down to the waterfront. He couldn't take it. There was something about it that he didn't like, and he moved out. He spent one night there. He probably didn't sleep. He left the next day.
There's one thing that always comes to mind is we were at a meeting one day on the Lowell Square development, and one of the residents of Charles River Park got up and spoke about his fabulous air-conditioned apartment, and I said to myself, I lived in the West End, and our air conditioning came from the Charles
the
River,
roof.
right on the roof. We'd open up our window, and the breeze from the Charles River. Boy, do I wish I had that breeze from the Charles River today.
At that same meeting, if
I wonder if anybody in West End today, in 1990, has any pigeons, grows pigeons in their roof.
Remember the roof, sure.
On the roof, everybody has those pigeons?
Right,
Oh, sure.
right.
There is no
Exactly.
pigeons down there.
No, I don't think so. I don't think
Probably
you-
shoot them.
You don't get that anymore.
Not in that area.
Today, in the West End, we used to hang around corners, different groups but we all got along. There was no fights among different groups. Do you recall?
I recall everybody getting along, but then you have to, I think a part of the reason was when I was there was during World War II. This country was really unified during World War II. That may have played a part. Later on, afterwards, I can remember growing up in Somerville, and you did have problems. The kids from Charlestown, the kids from Somerville, you did have some problems. Maybe that had something to do with it. But looking back, you'll never get, I don't think, in Boston, another era where so many diverse ethnic groups, white and black, live together in that type of harmony. It doesn't happen today, and I don't see it happening in the foreseeable future.
There were 24 different racial and ethnical groupings in the West End.
24, that's amazing. I didn't think it was that many. That's amazing.
We recently, for the past year, Jimmy and I have been doing some oral history taping of former residents of the West End, and it's been quite a project. And to watch these people's eyes open up and the smiles come back to their faces when they recall their childhood days in the West End, it's really been quite an experience. And someday we'll be showing them on
Those
stage.
tapings will be part of that exhibit at the Old State House. We have about 70 hours worth of tape, and they're going to cut pieces out of it and put it into and make an exhibit out of it as part of the exhibit. And there'll be more maps and everything else.
Is there anything you'd like to say before we have about a half a minute left before we close our show?
Yeah, a little coincidence. I was coming back on a troop ship once in 1956 into New York Harbor. Our ship was on standby the night the Andrea Doria was hit by the Stockholm steamer, and Ruth Roman, the former West End president, was aboard that ship, and we were on standby, I found this out later, to rescue everybody from that ship. It's just one of those coincidences. Two former West Enders.
Oh, great.
Like ships passing in the night.
Well, Peter, it was really an honor to have you here today. You've been really informative and been a great guest, and Jimmy. And see you at the next West End Video Newsletter.